So, good evening, students. In the very beginning, I request you to mute yourself, both audio and video, so that there will be no network problem. So, as I have shared with you, today we will discuss interest articulation. And this interest articulation is, you know, that it is the first input function of a political system given by Albont. Right. So, what is this interest articulation? What is actually articulation? Interest, we know how to understand interest. So, let me throw this question back to you. I mean, I will deal with the second part, what is articulation, but I want an answer from you. What is interest? And what is the significance of interest? So, can anybody answer? Interest basically means your needs, your demands, your requirements. And all these terms what I use, needs, demands, requirement, that is essential for your existence. That is called interest. So can you have something as your interest which is not related to your existence? Perhaps the answer will be no. And what is articulation? Right? What is articulation? Articulation basically means uh, saying something, reaching to someone, making something understand to the other side. So when I'm saying the teacher must articulate in the class, there should be articulation between teacher and student. It basically means teacher will not say things, rather than teacher should reach out to the students. Teacher uh, must convey what he or she understands to the student. In the same way, the student should also articulate to the teacher that the teacher must understand what the student is saying. So articulation basically it is a process of authentic understanding, right? And what is interest articulation? Interest articulation, it is a way for a member of society to express his or her needs to the system of government, right? The citizen, the individual, the member of the society must articulate, must authentically, making the government understand his needs, his requirement, his necessity. And all these are essential for a political system, all are essential for government to bring some policies so that the government will satisfy the needs of the people, and the people leads a greater life, right? So these all these policies are, in fact, it solves the existential problems of the individual. All these policies are related with the needs, requirement, demands of the people. So how these policies are made by the government? It is made by the government on the basis of interest that is articulated by the members of society to the system. So without demand, can the government make policies? Without knowing the needs, uh, demands, necessity of the people, can government make policies? Certainly not. Government requires all these demands so that the government can bring policies, and thereby government will reach out to the people, and ultimately it will strengthen the trust of the people on it. So demands are converted into decision by every political system. almost all decisions involve advantages and disadvantages for various individual groups in the society. Can we say that one particular policy brings happiness for all? Can we say that all the policies of the government, it brings unhappiness? No, certainly we cannot say that. Some of the people they get benefits from the policies, and some of the people they don't get. And why it happens like this? Why some people get advantages and some people get disadvantages, right? And to almost the advantage or the disadvantage of the decision of the government or governmental decision depends on the agencies who brought these demands to the attention of the decision maker, right? Why some people are satisfied, why some people are dissatisfied on a particular policy or on a particular decision, it is because there is a problem in the agencies which has brought these demands before the decision maker. There is some problem somewhere that agency has not given the authentic information to the government. Somewhere maybe the government has misunderstood it. So it is because of there is a uh, gap between the articulator and the government. Policies gives advantage to some, and policies uh, gives disadvantage to some. So the agencies which brings these demands must understand these demands, especially how, sorry, the agencies which bring these demands must understand how these demands are made by whom. Right. So before, I mean, there may be a fault line with the agencies. In other words, I use articulator, or maybe there is some problem in the understanding of the government. Right. So let's for a moment take there is problem with the articulator. Now, why articulator failed to give authentic, information, authentic input, authentic interest of the people of society to the system? Now, somewhere the agencies, the articulator, somewhere uh, he is unable to understand that how these demands are made by whom. The agency must understand what is this demand and how these demands are made and who is making all these demands. So a in-depth understanding of that process is very much required for the articulator or agencies to understand the interest authentically. And once the agencies and articulator understand it, then the government will also understand it. It is just like if teacher understands certain things clearly, and when teacher articulates certain things to students, then automatically students they understand it. So the process by which demands are made by the individual and group is called interest articulation. So what is this interest articulation? Now, interest articulation is basically it is a process. Now it is a process of understanding. It is a process through which demands are made by the individual and group. Right. So how demands are made by individual and group? That is the process of uh, you know the process through which a demand is made by the people and group is called the interest articulation process. One has to understand that process, how a demand is made. A demand is made by whom, when, how, why, all these things. Interest articulation is the first functional step in the political conversion process. So political conversion process basically means when uh, political conversion process means what? Uh, a process of conversion in which the inputs becomes output, right? And for almond, you know that for almond, it is the political system that is there in the input side and that is there in the output side, right? So when political system is at the output side, then the political system directly involves. And when the political system is at the input side, then political system is indirectly it is involved. So it is in fact the political system that plays a very crucial role in the process of interest articulation, right? So this interest articulation is the first step or first functional step in the political conversion process. So first is the interest articulation, interest aggregation, political communication, then the output function, it begins. And this political articulation makes the boundary between the society and the political system. What does it mean? It means for almond, there must be the boundary of a political system. There must be a boundary of society or the non-political institution, political system and non-political system. Now, for almond, interest articulation is within the boundary of the society. Though Almond knew that it is not possible to distinguish between political system and the society. That without political system you cannot imagine a society. And society is the major concern of the political system. Right. It is the political system that plays a crucial role in the interest articulation process that happens within the society. Right? So it has its respective boundary. We cannot say that political system does interest articulation. We cannot say that. Interest articulation is done by the society. But how the society articulates its interest, now it is because of the mobilization of the political system. It is because of the political communication of the political communication of the political system. The society, gets all the information, knowledge from the political system, and it helps the society to, make its own demand, needs, interest. If groups within the society do not find channels to express their interest or needs, these demands remains unsatisfied. The resultant dissatisfaction may erupt in violence. Right. So interest articulation is the must. Why? If there will be no interest articulation, if people or society, if individual or groups within the society, they do not find any channel to express their interests, need, desires, then they will face the existential problem and they will be dissatisfied on the political system. In fact, political system must promote this interest articulation. most promote, most support, most positively contribute to the interest articulation process. Right. Otherwise, people will be dissatisfied, and ultimately people will start, violation, or people will uh, uh, do the violence. Right. So it is through interest articulation that conflict inherent in the political culture and social structure become evident. Right. So when individual or group makes a demand or interest, it is not so easy. It is not at all easy because group interest vary from one another. Individual interest vary from one another. Whether it is group or individual, they present their interest in such a way that as if they are talking about all, or they are representing all. Right. But if they are representing all, if all the group, all the individuals, while expressing their interest, if they are representing all, then certainly there will be no conflict. But why conflict happens? It happens individual and group, they hide their private interest, and on the other hand they try to uh, you know they try to convince the other side by uh, linking their position with the common good. So basically, though it appears that there is common good in the interest of individual, in the interest of group, but uh, if you study deeply, then you will find there is a private interest, and there is always a class of interest, and that's why there is conflict. Right. So uh, this conflict for almond, it is necessary for the development. Right. And almond uh, you know understands that it is the interest articulation that exposes that conflict. That conflict is required. That conflict is required uh, for creating a authentic interest of the society. Right. That conflict is necessary. Right. That we should not hide that conflict. That conflict is inherent in the political culture. That conflict is inherent in the social structure. And it is through the process of interest articulation that conflict gets exposed, and ultimately that conflict helps to uh, create a genuine interest of the society. And later on, there is also the requirement of the means of articulation. I will come to that later. So the manner of expression to these demands may intensify the conflict or reconcile or mitigate it. Right. So as I said, there is a private interest in the individual, in the group. They hide that private interest. They place their interest in such a way that it is the common good, right? Now we know that there are private interests. We know that there is a kind of conflict. One individual is not agreeing with the other individual. One group is not agreeing with the other group. Now, in such a situation, individual, I mean, the manner of expression of the individual, the manner of expression of the group, right? Now, it may intensify the conflict, or it may reconcile or mitigate the conflict altogether. Right. Now, when The manner of expression will intensify conflict only when the people, the group, when they do not understand the other side, right? But when the individual and group understand the other side, then their manner of expression is, or it will tilt towards the reconciliation, or towards reconciling that conflict, towards mitigating that conflict, right? So it's all about the manner of expression. So when demands are made by the individual and the group, then there may be a conflict that will be intensified, or there will be reconciliation and mitigation of that conflict. So demands are, I mean, how demands are made, the process is not a easy process, right? In, I mean, take for example in your family, when uh, you know uh, the family decides something, right? When your family, define their needs, requirements, etc., then there is a kind of conversation between the members of the family. Sometimes argumentation becomes very harsh, and some in some family, when the member discuss and deliberate on that issue, I mean, what should be the decision of the family as a whole. In some family, they try to understand each other, they try to sacrifice certain things, and all members are ready to sacrifice for the other. Now, in that family, I mean, while deciding a, a, a while deciding a certain decision of that family as a whole, that family, you will not find conflict. Rather than all these family members, they reconcile the conflict, they mitigate that conflict. And it exactly, it happens in this society as well, right? So the character of different political system depends on the form of interest articulation, the structure of interest articulation, the style of interest articulation, right? So when I'm saying the form of interest articulation, what does it mean? I mean, interest articulation can take different form. For example, interest articulation can take the form of violence. Interest articulation can take the form of personal connection. Interest articulation can take the form of elite representation. I'll come to that when I will deal with means of articulation. I will analyze it in detail. Interest articulation can take the form of mass media. Interest articulation can take the form of political party, etc., etc. So there are different forms of interest articulation. There are different structures of interest articulation. For example, let me give you an example. What are the different structures of interest articulation? One structure is, what I will say, the anomic interest group. Another structure of interest articulation is the non-associational interest group, then the associational interest group, then institutional interest group. So there are different structures of interest group. There are different forms of there are different structures of interest articulation. There are different forms of interest articulation. There are different styles of interest articulation. Right? And as a result, you can find different political system. In different political system, you will find the different form of political articulation, different structure of political articulation, different style of political articulation. Right. So mainly there are four aspects of interest articulation. And what are those four aspects? First, the structure that perform the interest articulation. Second, the channels through which demands are articulated. Third, the style of interest articulation. And fourth, the effect of modernization on articulation. Right. So let me take 1 minute break and coming back. Welcome back. So first is the structure of interest articulation. Now, what is the structure of interest articulation? Interest articulation is done by variety of structure, from an undisciplined mob to business conference. Right? When there is a strike, when there is a hartal, when there is a undisciplined mob, it is also the structure of interest articulation. When there is a business conference, that is also a structure of interest articulation. Right. So when students ask a question to the teacher, that is also another structure of interest articulation. Right. How? When the students ask a question, why I said it is a structure of interest articulation? Can anybody explain? When there is a undisciplined mob, why it is called a structure of interest articulation? Can anybody respond to me? Anyone?
Sir, it can be that it is a promotion of or promotion of claims of a person.
It basically means when the undisciplined mob, they are acting, they are also giving certain inputs. They are giving inputs to the political system regarding their needs, demands, interest. When there is a business conference, it also gives inputs to the political system. When the student is asking any question to the teacher, by asking the question, the student is also helping the teacher to understand the needs, demands of the student. Thereby, in a class, the teacher is the, you know, the representative of the political system, and student represents the society. Right. So there are variety of structures of political articulation, and such structures are classified into two types. One is a group that initiates articulation, and the channels through which articulations is made. But we should not be confused here that, for example, let me say you political party. Now, political party belongs to the first category or it belongs to the second category. So I said the structure of interest articulations is classified into two types. The first, the group that initiates articulation, and the second, the channel through which articulation is made. If I say political party, now political party also initiates interest articulation, and political party also acts like a acts like a channel, right? So these two types of the structure of interest articulations are not mutually exclusive to each other. They are inclusively, related. In North and South, both group and channel are important part of interest articulation. A typical group uses a typical channel. For example, the violent mob, right? The violent mob, they will not use the mass media as a channel for their articulation. They will use violence, right? Now, if it is an institutional interest group such as political parties, church, armies, bureaucracies, if it is an institutional interest group, then they will not use violence as a channel. Rather, they will use mass media for their articulation, right? So, a typical group uses a typical channel. For example, associational group articulates interest through regular and legal channel, and regional and kinship group uses informal, intermittent, informal channels. Informal channels. Okay. However, in abnormal situation, it is seen that associational groups such as trade union organizes riots, strikes, which is not at all formal in nature. So what we see, that all groups, they do not use one particular channel, they use their own different channels. The violent mob will not use mass media as a channel, they will use violence as a channel, they will do riot, everything they will do. If the group is a associational group, if that group is a institutional group, then certainly they will not use the personal channel, they will not use either violence, they will not use personal connection, rather they use certain regular and legal channel. If the group is regional, if the group is a kinship group, right, then this group uses informal channel, right? So what is a kinship group? What is a regional group? What is a associational group and what is a regional and kinship group? Why I said that associational group, they uses the regular and legal channel, and regional and kinship group, they use the informal channel. Why? It is because the associational group, there is a organization, there are certain rules, regulation. When I'm saying associational group, doesn't mean that these are the institutional group. It is not based on government rules and regulation. Rather than associational groups are guided by the private administration, not the public administration. And these associational groups, since they are guided by the private administration, they do not use the personal channel. They do not use violence. They do not use personal, uh, you know, personal connection. But it is seen that the trade union as a associational group, it has many times it has organized riots and strikes, and these riots and strikes are the form of violence. So trade union as a associational group, trade union means union that is guided by the private administration. So trade union, by using violence, right, it has proved that the associational group in abnormal situation may not use the formal channel, it may use the informal channel. So it is safe to say that all the group may use informal channel in order to bring the demands to the attention of the relevant decision maker. All group, whether it is a associational group or whether it is a kinship group, all group uses the informal channel. The associational group, first they will use the formal channel, but if it will not work, then the associational group will use the informal channel. For example, trade union depends on riots, violence. And why the trade union depends on violence? At any cost, the trade union wants the attention of the decision maker so that the decision maker will understand their needs, their interests. But the trade union, in the very beginning, the trade union will not depend on violence. Rather, the trade union will depend on regular and legal channel. But if the regular and legal channel will not work, then the trade union depends on violence. Right. And these groups may be called as the interest group. And what is the interest group? A group which constantly fights with the political system, with the government, by using various means. That is a constant fight. And what is the purpose? What is the goal of that fight? The purpose is to satisfy their interest. So by interest group, we mean a group of individuals who are linked by a particular bond of concern, who are linked by a particular bond of concern or advantage, and who have some awareness of this bond. So interest group, they constantly they run behind the government. They use various means. If one means fails, they use another means. But they are conscious about, they are aware about their interest demands. So when we talk about interest group, how to understand an interest group? Now any discussion on interest group starts with individual as an articulator of their own interest. Right. No interest group can be formed if individual as an articulator of their own interest is not there. In a society, if there are individuals as an articulator of their interest are there, in that society, one can think about the interest group. Now, such individual self-representation is the must for constructing a interest group. Now, how individuals represent himself. Now, individual self-representation is mostly put in such a way as if it is the group interest. So every individual interest or individual puts his or her interest in such a way that as if it is not his or her private interest, rather than it is a common good, it is a public interest. Just before I said individual interest, I mean individual hides his or her private interest while putting it as a kind of common good. Now in democratic society, individual interest articulation is checked and ordered by the group control. So there will be, obviously there will be conflict. If individual will hide his or her private interest, if individual is put his private interest as a common good, then certainly there will be conflict. Today you see how different political parties, they compete with each other. If they are representing the people of India, then why there is conflict between them? This is the question. That means there is a private interest of different political parties. So in the name of people, they are doing everything, but there is a private interest. So in democratic society, individuals' interest articulation is checked and ordered by the group control. So there is a group which will control the individual self-representation. But in a dictatorial society, such group control is missing. Right. Such group control is missing, and as a result, I mean, if the individual is a powerful individual, then that individual becomes a dictator because nobody is there to check that individual. That group control is missing in the dictatorial society. Now, this individual self-representation to almond, if it is not checked, then it may establish a dictatorial society. Right. And here Almond is saying, somewhat akin to the individual self-representation are the structures called economic interest group, a group from society that more or less spontaneously penetrates into political system by doing riots, demonstration, etc. Now, what is a economic interest group? Now, economic interest group is a group that is suddenly created, right? That is spontaneous, it is a spontaneous group with a collective response to a particular frustration. For example, in Hyderabad University in recent past, when Rohit Vemula died, suddenly a group emerged. Now the death of Rohit Vemula was the cause of their frustration towards the political system. So suddenly a group emerged and they started a movement. So this is called economic interest group. Just before the death of Rohit Vemula, the members of that group were not ever about whether they will come together or not. It is because of an emergent situation the group was spontaneously created, and they started responding collectively to a particular problem or situation. Now such group in the society are also there. Such group in the societies are also there, and they try to challenge the political system. They try to articulate their interest. But what is the problem with this anomic interest group? The problem of anomic interest group is marked by the limited organization. I mean, that anomic interest group doesn't have its own organization. Now, if there is an emergent situation, if there is a problem, if that problem causes their frustration, then what suddenly, spontaneously, a group gets created and they put their collective response to the political system. Now, when that frustration disappears, then that group disappears as well. So today in the Hyderabad University, you will not find that group. But at that time, that group was very powerful. Almost all political leaders, national political leaders, they were all visiting to the Hyderabad University. They were all, coming to that group in support of Rohit Vemula. But the problem with anomic interest group is that now once the problem disappears, that group disappears because that anomic interest group doesn't have its own organization. There is lacking of constant activity of the group. When the problem is there, then there is some activity. When the problem gradually disappears, then the activity of the group also gradually disappears with that problem. So here, to Almond, here there is a need for non-associational interest group. Right. Here we are understanding how the interest groups, came into existence. Now, interest group came into existence with individuals' self-representation. Then subsequently, the individual self-representation converted into anomic interest group. Now, Almond is saying it is, some defects are there in the anomic interest group. That's why there is a requirement of non-associational interest group. Non-associational interest group. And what are the non-associational interest group? For example, kinship group, lineage group, ethnic group, class group, right? And all these groups, they articulate their interest through individual, through family, through religious head. Now, in this non-associational interest group, one will find a kind of organization. In the kinship group, there is an organization. In the lineage group, there is an organization. In the ethnic group, there is an organization. Right. In the class group, there is an organization. And what are the distinguishing characteristics of such interest group? There are three distinguishing characteristics of non-associational group. The first is the intermittent pattern of articulation. Second is the absence of organized procedure. Third is the lack of continuity in the internal structure. So this non-associational interest group, it is better than the anomic interest group, because anomic interest group disappears with the disappearance of the problem. But the kinship group, it doesn't disappear, it is still there. If the problem disappears, still the kinship group is there. lineage group is there, ethnic group is there, class group is there, right? So what is intermittent pattern of articulation? Intermittent means stopping for a short time, then starting again several times. So it basically means the non-associational group, they do not articulate their interest to the political system constantly, right? The articulation of their interest by the non-associational interest group is not continuous, rather it is intermittent. It means they articulate their interest for some time, then they stop, again they articulate their interest, then they stop. So there is no constant pressure on the political system by the non-associational interest group. And the second characteristic is the absence of the organized procedure, right? In the non-associational interest group, you will not find any, you will not find their actions based on rules and regulation, formal rules and regulation. They are mostly guided by the informal rules or convention. And the third characteristic of non-associational interest group is the lack of continuity in the internal structure. For example, let's take a kinship group. Now, one generation of the kinship group, they articulate their interest, but the other generation do not. For example, let me give you, in a family, you will find one generation that was politically very active, right? Contesting election, becoming a MLA or MP. But the next generation, he is not or she is not interested in the politics. He or she is dormant, right? So in a family, in a kinship group, when one generation articulates its interest, the other generation does not. So this is the non-associational interest group, right? Till now, we have not reached the institutional interest group. Institutional interest group. Now, in highly differentiated modern society, the influence of non-associational interest group is very limited. It is because in such society, numerous organized group competes one another. In this society, important non-associational interest group develops organized structure and thereby fall into one of the two following classes of interest group. So what it means? Now, in fact, all these characteristics of non-associational interest group are actually the defects of it, right? Today we are in 21st century. Today we understand interest group, that interest group must constantly put pressure on the government to satisfy their interest. But in the non-associational interest group, that constant pressure is not there, right? In 21st century, when we talk about interest group, then we understand the interest group must have some organized procedure. But that non-associational interest group doesn't have any organized procedure, right? So hence, With the passing of time, the non-associational interest group, I mean, did not contribute to the political system effectively, right? So in a highly differentiated modern society, in a developed society, the influence of non-associational interest group became very limited, because nobody gave importance to this non-associational interest group. It is because in the developed or modern society, numerous organized group, they compete one another, right? In the developed society, you know organized group had already emerged, and all these organized group, they were competing one another. So in that society, the non-associational group, what was prevalent in the traditional society, became irrelevant, and this non-associational group started organizing its structure. It started organizing its structure, and thereby these non-associational group fell into one of the two following classes of interest group. And what are those two interest group? One is the institutional interest group, another is the associational interest group. So these non associational interest group became the associational interest group, and some of the non-associational interest group, by fighting the election, by winning the election, it became institutional interest group. So let me take 1 minute break, then I'm coming back. Welcome again. So as I said, with the passing of time, the non-associational interest group became, or some of the non-associational interest group became the institutional interest group, and some of the non-associational interest group became the associational interest group. What is the institutional interest group? Mostly it is composed of political parties, church, armies, bureaucracy. These are the institutional interest group. Something which is related with the power directly. Political parties are related with the power, related with the government. Church is related with the government or power. Army and bureaucracies are related with the government and power. So these are the formal organization composed of professionally employed personnel with designated political and social function. Political parties constitute, so among the institutional interest group, there are different kinds of institutional interest group. Among all these, institutional interest group, political parties constitute the base for the institutional interest group, and around which the other kinds of institutional interest group revolves around, right? So political party is the base, is the center, around which church, army, bureaucracy, all are the institutional interest group that they revolves around. An institutional interest group occupies a powerful position in the society because of the strength provided by their organizational strength. So in the institutional interest group, one can find that their organizational strength is very high, and as a result, these institutional interest group, they are very powerful in the society. In the underdeveloped societies, institutional interest groups are very powerful, which does not give any scope to the associational interest group to develop. So one thing we find that in the developed society, you can find large number of associational interest group, and in the underdeveloped society you can find a large number of institutional interest group. In the underdeveloped society, the institutional interest group does not give any scope to the associational interest group to grow. And what is the associational interest group? What are the examples of associational interest group? I'll tell you subsequently. So associational interest group are the specialized structure for interest articulation. For example, and what are those associational interest group? For example, trade union, industrialist organization, ethnic association, civic group. These are the associational interest group, and these associational interest group are not less powerful than the institutional interest group. Institutional interest group are more powerful than the associational interest group, but in some cases, sometimes, some situation, the associational interest group prevail upon the institutional interest group. For example, political party cannot ignore the trade union. Political party is the base of institutional interest group. It is the most powerful institutional interest group, political party. But can political party ignore trade union? Can political party ignore the industrialist organization, ethnic association, civic group? No, it cannot. So you will find in America, most of the developed countries, you will find institutional interest group and associational interest group, together. Their institutional interest group, does not become obstacle before the emergence of associational interest group. But in underdeveloped society or developing society, you will find the institutional interest group, they tries to maintain their dominance over the associational interest group. Even in many cases, they become the obstacle before the emergence of associational interest group. And what are the major characteristics of associational interest group? There are three major characteristics of associational interest group. First, explicit representation of their group interest. So this associational interest group, they are explicitly concerned about their group interest. At any cost, they will not surrender their interest. And in this group, there is full-time professional staff. Once you are part of the trade union, then you are continues to be the part of the trade union. If you are part of the industrialist organization, then you continues to be part of the industrialist organization. You cannot be part, a common individual, a volatile individual cannot be part of trade union or industrialist organization or ethnic association or civic group. Right. To be part of the associational interest group, the individual must have some virtue. And the third characteristic is that orderly procedure for the formulation of their interest. In the associational group, there are procedures, and they follow that procedure. They follow the principles of private administration. There is no much difference between the public and private administration. Right. In fact, if you compare today the public administration and the private administration, then you will find the private administration is much more effective and efficient than the public administration today. They are very much, guided by the procedure. They are very much orderly. Right. So in fact, in modern sense, what we call the interest group, it means we understand the associational interest group. We do not understand the institutional interest group. In institutional interest group are very much close related with the power. But the associational interest group, they challenge to the power. They try to, they try to, what I will say, they try to, create genuine societal interest. Since they are not related with the power, they are more concerned about the society. The trade union is more concerned about the society. The civic group is more concerned about the society. So where these associational interest group are present and are allowed to flourish, they tend to regulate the development of other types of the interest group. Right? So if the political system of any country, if they promote these associational interest group, then these associational interest group, they try to regulate the development of other kinds of interest group. Right. Let me give you example. In India, in some sense, I will say the right ideology, let me say that this right ideology belongs to the institutional interest group, and the left ideology belongs to the associational interest group. Right. And the right ideology will not want the growth of left ideology. The institutional interest, or in other words, the institutional interest group will not want the associational interest group to grow. Right. Imagine a situation, there is another country, and in that country, the institutional interest group gives that scope to the associational interest group to grow. Then in that country, you will find how the associational interest group regulate, how the associational interest group tries to control the other kinds of interest group, and how the associational group regulates or controls the other kinds of interest group? It is because these associational interest group, they have the organizational base, and their organizational base gives them an advantage over the non-associational group. Their tactics and goals are often recognized as legitimate in the society. Right. So today, when we say the interest group, it means it is the associational interest group. Right. So I'm stopping here. In the next class, we will discuss the internal dynamics of interest group, how group performs their interest articulation function, right? And what are the important characteristic of interest articulation, then what are the means of articulation. There are many things in this chapter, interest articulation of Almond, I mean of that book, Comparative Politics and Developmental Approach. There are many things, many important points. I need to articulate all these to you. Then finally, when we will conclude it, a overall picture will come before our eyes. Let me know how many of you have read and understand this chapter, interest articulation. Have you faced any difficulty while understanding interest articulation? Anyone?
For me, no, sir.
You got it absolutely?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, if you got it absolutely, then tell me your critical points of my today's presentation or today's lecture.
Of course, my network tripled at one particular point, but from your introduction, you have first introduced interest, what is interest, and what is articulation, of which you have said interest articulation is the way of expressing demands, needs into the political system or government of the political system. And from there, you have talked about how this interest goes into our political system through different groups, interest groups, which you have talked about association groups and institutional groups. Of course, I don't know whether you mentioned about dynamic groups or non-association groups, because I said my network at some point tripled. So you have emphasized on the difference between association groups and institutional groups, of which you said in the modern understanding of interest groups, you are talking about association groups, not institutional groups, because the association groups, they challenge the power, but also they present the genuine interest of the people of the society. Whereby the institutional groups, they are more attached to the power, so it becomes more difficult to be critical to the power. At this point, you have left that you will come back to us with techniques of interest articulation and characteristics of interest articulation, so that we can have the whole picture.
Thank you, Durati. I mean, you just summarized what I said. You just simplify it, but it is almond. And I mean, if you read that chapter critically, then you will find many critical points, right? Even I faced difficulty while, initially I was thinking that I can handle it very easily, but I faced some difficulty. Uh, right. I mean, how Almond started the understanding of interest group with individual as a articulator or individual self-representation, right? Then he moved to anomic interest group. I gave the example of the Rohit Vemola, suddenly how group is created looking at the emergent situation. and they try to pressurize the government. With the disappear of that problem or frustration of that group also disappear. And how Almond, next to the economic interest group, how Almond has talked about non-associational group. Non-associational group or non-associational interest group is better than the economic interest group, but it has its own defects. Then the Almond talked about in a developed and modern society, you will find the importance of non-associational groups are decreasing. For example, in the traditional society, there was the importance of non-associational group. And what is this non-associational group? Mostly it is a family group, it is a kinship group, it is a ethnic group, it is a class group, right? And these are not formal, these are very much informal. And with the emergence of the modern nation state system, the or non-associational interest group gradually it uh, lost its importance. Numerous organized group emerge and they compete with one another, and that is why some important non-associational interest group, they modified themselves, they develop an organized structure within themselves, and thereby these non-formal or non-associational interest group, some non-associational interest group became the institutional interest group, and some became the associational interest group, right? So I mean, Durati, you have read it, so am I missing any point?
So of course, I was skeptical on the measures of interest groups.
Yeah.
I think Armand borrowed from the Arthur Bentley and David Truman, who talked about group theory of politics, whereby they in a broader way explained about the interest groups, like for the all four types of interest groups, like in a very comprehensive way. But also there's also another writer who wrote a book about interest groups, of which these have been like explained in the very comprehensive way than the way Armand explained. But
Okay.
in
If you yeah, yeah,
in
continue.
whole essence, you did not miss anything from the introductory part to this
No, no,
point.
I'm just dealing with that chapter only. So I have not dependent on the outside, sources. In that chapter, it is written in this society, important non-associational interest group develop organized structure and thereby fall into one of the two following classes of interest group. And these two classes of interest group are the institutional interest group on one hand and associational interest group on the other. So some of the non-associational interest group became the institutional interest group. I mean, they contested election. I mean, they uh, formed a political party. And some of the non-associational group, they connected themselves with the church, right? And some of the non-associational interest group, I mean, through army, they try to, uh, who are the army personnel? These army personnel are the member of a some families. Now these family, they come together, or the members of that family come together under the banner of army, and they try to articulate their interest. So some non-associational interest group became the institutional interest group, and some non-associational interest group became the associational interest group. And the conflict between the institutional interest group and associational interest group is that one is close to the power, another challenges to the power. In
Yes, sir.
modern day, on modern day, when we talk about interest group, it it means both. It means a group that is with the power, group that is against the power, right? And both these interest group are very much needed for the society, because almonds see conflict positively. How to how to form the interest of the society, how the interest of the society is formed. It is formed through the conflict. And today we see interest group with power and interest group against power. There is a conflict, and there is the emergence of the genuine interest of the society, or genuine societal interest. So I'll there are again I said that there are many things will come, right? And the way I made some clarification, it is not written so clearly in that chapter. But if you read, if you understand the spirit of that chapter, then you will come to this kind of interpretation or conclusion. So I'm stopping here. Maybe tomorrow at this time from 5 to 6:30, we will continue and we will complete this interest articulation. So thank you very much.